tactics. It was as if the South Vietnamese did not exist. The bombs dropped on North Vietnam had reached tonnage levels that compared with what the Allies dropped in World War II in Europe. No end was in sight. In cities across America, demonstrators marched in protest against Johnson and the war. Johnson had escalated the Vietnam War without paying attention to the public and Congress. Everything else he had worked for and believed in suffered.
I mean, the country can't fight two wars at once. One, a constructive war to enhance the quality of life for everybody, and the other a war against a foreign enemy, which is proving increasingly resistant and difficult to overcome. So it paralyzed the Great Society.
Johnson had lost control over what he knew best, the Congress. By mid-1967, he seriously considered not running for re-election in 1968. Johnson also greatly feared becoming gravely ill while he was in office.
He talked about Woodrow Wilson having a stroke and being incapacitated in his last couple of years in the White House.
He used to actually have to get out of his bed with his flashlight, go look at the picture of Woodrow Wilson on the wall to remind himself that that was Wilson. He was Lyndon Johnson. He did not have a stroke yet, and he was alive.
But Johnson could not decide to stay or go. The North Vietnamese made his decision for him when they launched the Tet Offensive in late January 1968. The intense fighting across South Vietnam was dramatic proof to the American people that the war was unwinnable. Then, on March 31st, 1968, at the end of a televised speech to the nation, he made his stunning declaration.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
He was a political realist. And what he understood was that if he tried to run again, he would possibly lose the nomination and possibly, maybe even probably, lose the election. And it would have been horribly humiliating and distressing to him. And it disturbed him deeply that there was so much division and dissent. And so his take on things was he should step down, he should step aside.
But I think it was partly that the political situation was paralyzed for him, so he internalized that paralysis into his physical being, and his old fears of dying young returned. And I think that was a huge part of the reason why he ended up deciding not to run again in '68, figuring that at some point he would become paralyzed.
In his last 9 months in office, Lyndon Johnson would be a lame duck president. He and America had to struggle through the remaining months of 1968, an unforgettable year filled with assassinations, riots in the streets, and the seemingly endless war in Vietnam. 4 days after President Johnson made his stunning announcement that he would not run for a second term, the nation was further shocked on April 4th, 1968, when the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Riots erupted in dozens of cities across the nation, and Johnson dispatched troops to restore order. 1968 had become a year of turmoil. Senator Robert Kennedy, while campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination in Los Angeles, was also assassinated. It was a difficult time for the country and for Johnson in his last months in office. The high cost of the war had taken a serious bite from his programs. His dreams of a great society had been mostly shattered. Johnson was an unhappy man. His days as president would soon be over. His only respite was when he returned to his beloved Hill Country ranch. As soon as he stepped on his cherished Texas earth, he was revitalized, a man unleashed from all his cares.
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
In January 1969, Richard Nixon was sworn in as president. Lyndon Johnson, at 60 years of age, was out of power, out of the public eye for the first time in more than 32 years. He retired permanently to his ranch home close to where he was born, and where the adjustments to his new life would not be easy.
It was difficult for him to be a passive character. His whole life had been so engaged with being active, with doing things, with performing, with achieving.
On the ranch, Johnson kept busy writing his memoirs, working with Lady Bird on her autobiography, and helping build his monument, the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library. But his life was different from the one he had lived in Washington.
In the mornings, he'd have meetings just like he used to in the White House, but no longer was it the White House staff he was meeting with, but his 6 field hands to determine how many eggs would be laid that day, or how many tractors would get fixed in which fields.
Johnson stayed mostly on the ranch, spending as much time as possible with family and friends.
And I think as a result of not having a purpose for his life, a larger ambition, there was always an underlying sadness. Now, he could camouflage it at times. First of all, he looked great in those last years. He let his hair grow, and it softened his image to have these white curls surrounding his hair. And he seemed to be in good spirits. But my impression, seeing him over and over again during that period of time, was that he was never a happy man, and then almost was willing himself to die by the end.
In his retirement, Johnson ignored his doctor's advice. He started smoking again. He drank more than he did when he was in the White House, and he put on weight. Johnson's health was not good in his last years.
He began having angina attacks after 1 year and 2 months after he got out of the presidency, so that ruled his life pretty much.
But Johnson still made the occasional speech. One of his last major public appearances was at a symposium on civil rights at the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin 6 weeks before he died.
My doctor admonished me not to speak at all this morning.
In the middle of his address, he reached into his pocket.
I'm going to do that because...
And he put something into his mouth. And those of us who knew and loved him then had absolutely no doubt, as I did, that what he'd done was taken a nitroglycerin and put it under his tongue, and he looked so strained. And so when the address was over, I threw my arms around him, and I said to him, "Daddy, Daddy, what's wrong?" And he said, "Oh, Lucy, I had a severe attack of angina last night."
After that severe attack of chest pain in Austin, Johnson spent his time resting at the ranch in Johnson City. He was clearly not well, but no one around him knew how seriously ill he really was. In the mid-afternoon of January 22, 1973, 64-year-old Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, suffered a fatal heart attack. His body first lay in state at the Johnson Library in Austin. Then it was taken to the rotunda of the Capitol in Washington, where more than 40,000 people filed past the coffin. In the late afternoon of the next day, a chilly day filled with rain, on the northern bank of the Pedernales River, Lyndon Johnson was buried beneath a sprawling oak tree, next to his mother and father, in the family graveyard on his ranch.
I talked to him days before he died, and his only hope for being remembered in the long run was what he had done for civil rights, and I think he deserves every credit in the world for that.
He had a heart. He had a compassion, and he could be tough as nails, but generally it was to deliver something that he felt the country would be better with.
In some ways, he was his own worst enemy. There was such a grandiosity to him. There was such an ambition to him. In some ways, he so overreached himself. He promised more than he could deliver. But he was a man of enormous buoyancy, of confidence, of great faith in this country, and that's partly what he played out in his years as president.